out and burn everything in them. Don't save your food from one year to the next, but burn up your old crops you haven't eaten. Of course, that destroyed a lot of the rat, and that's the rat feeding ground. The rats had to leave. But there was another reason. This is something I've only found out, folks, since April. I did not know before. Pope Gregory VII had issued a papal decree that cats were of the devil and that Christians should destroy their cats. Your old maids didn't. I mean, you ask an old maid to part with her cat, forget it. And your Jews did not feel like they were under the Pope, so they didn't destroy their cats either. But Christians destroyed their cats in droves, and it was a disaster. This you can find if you look up. I mean, it's hard to, Gregory VII, but yeah, it's a little known fact of history, but something I just learned, that the Pope ordered the cats to be destroyed. Cats have been victims of superstition down through the ages, but for a farmer, they're really good investments. Not everybody likes them, and they have their quirks and whatever. But anyway, Black Death came, and it stopped the Crusades. But a lot of persons say that the Black Death really did a lot of good for Europe because, number one, European rulers and European nobles, rich people, had to start paying higher wages to the poor, the few that were left, because there were so few workers. So European noblemen had to start paying higher wages. This enabled more serfs to get their freedom. Also, Europeans became less afraid of death, which meant Europeans would venture out farther into the ocean. Eventually, they crossed the Atlantic. The bubonic plague was to remain in Europe until the year 1750. Starting in 1307, the plague finally died out in 1750, and folk. All right, let me tell you. This is verifiable. The climate, really hot in the high Middle Ages, got colder, got warmer again, then came the little ice age of the 1600s. By 1750 here, you had a warming. All right, this is 13, this is 1680, 370 years. All right, 1680, 370. Would have been 2, pardon me. Folk, we might be due another ice age within a few years. We also tell by tree rings. Now, in the case of little ice age, that's well documented. We know that the climate cooled in. But in the case of the Black Death, we study tree rings, but unfortunately, tree rings don't go back as far. But we think that the fall of the Roman Empire and the fall of the Chinese dynasty might have been caused the same thing. What I can prove, folk, as much as can be proven, is that every time the climate rises, it turns around and falls. And I don't think that man's output has anything at all to do with it. I think the sun above us warms and cools based on the sunspot cycles. We just found out that the Chinese have been recording sunspots long before the Europeans discovered them. If we can get their records and records of the ancients, we might be able to prove more than what we. Anyway, that's pure speculation, though. But what is actually fact is the climate has warmed and cooled all down through the age, and the climate cooling seems to have gotten the Black Death started. And in 1680, you had people dying by the millions in Europe, India, and China. It got as far south as India in the late 1600s. It was called the Little Ice Age. Poor old Queen Anne in the early 1700s had some 14 pregnancies. One son lived 10 years. Most of her births were stillborn. And what I'm saying is even the upper classes did not escape. Most of her children were stillborn. She had one son that lived 10 years. Another couple of children who died in infancy, and maybe one who died as a preschooler. Every one of her children, she died childless. And a phone went to her cousin and she died. Again, not even the upper classes escaped. All right. Now, time went on. Eventually, Europe found a way to deal with the Black Death. Now, during this time of turmoil, England and France went to war. This war is called the 100 Years' War. Hundred Years' War largely it was fought over the throne. I could go into more detail, and believe me, I would. But basically what happened was the King of France died without an heir. The King of England, who was related to the King of France, the line of France, I mean, these nobles would marry each other. The King of England says, I should be the King of France. The people of France chose a Frenchman to be king, who was related to the royal line. I mean, he was related. They said, no, we'll pick our own king. So the King of England went to war. The war was to last 100 years. The 100 Years' War did a lot to change warfare. For the first time, gunpowder was used. Oh yes, they used gunpowder. They also, for the first time, your knight in armor no longer dominated the battlefield. The English came up with two weapons, the longbow and the crossbow. Now, the longbow is 6 feet long and has really thick wood and could shoot an arrow through armor. Now, the crossbow was made of extremely heavy wood, and it had to be mechanically cocked. But it would shoot like a rifle. It would just shoot from a stock, that stock like a rifle. And it could shoot an arrow really, really hard and straight. Now, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Okay, several, yeah. The crossbow is the most accurate bow ever invented by man. But when these Englishmen started shooting, and then a lot of your bowmen were men of low birth, and an Englishman could shoot a crossbow at a French duke and go through the duke's shield and his armor and right into his body and kill the duke, which is something that could hardly have happened before. At one time, the knight in armor controlled the battle. Few knights had been killed up until this time, but also the cannonball could knock out a knight in armor. The knights began to put on more armor, and it got so bad if a knight fell down, it took 5 men to lift him back up. If a knight fell off his horse, well, most of the time, your knights who fell off the horse in battle simply suffocated to death in their armor. They could not get themselves up, and they could not breathe either. They suffocated inside their armor. If they were wounded, and yes, these arrows could penetrate, a lot of times they suffocated where they died if their wounds was, nobody could tend to them with that heavy armor on. Eventually, soldiers got to where they did not wear armor. Now, today, I understand our troops have armor that's bulletproof. It's much, much lighter in weight and can be more easily taken on and off. Some of you might know a little bit about that, but some of our troops when we started to use, but not armor made of metal, but armor made of a certain type of composite material. It's at least proof against small type of bullets. But anyway, the knight in armor eventually became outmoded, out of fashion, all as a result of the 100 Years' War. Now, I'm going to get through the 100 years. There were two battles where the French charged in with mounted cavalry, and they rainstorm companies. Horses slipped in the mud and broke their legs. And if you know anything about when a horse breaks its leg, and this is still true, you take his life. There's nothing you can do to fix it. Now, there are persons who say that today's medicine could fix a horse, but so certain breaks, but most of the time, that the horse simply cannot ever. He cannot walk on, not like a dog who can walk on 3 legs or a cat who can walk on 3 legs, at least temporarily. Horses cannot. They're gone. But anyway, I'm going to jump to the end of the war. There was a young woman named Joan of Arc. Late in the war was going badly for the French. The French had a king who was indecisive, could not come to firm decisions. It turns out the French king's father had gone insane, and the word had gotten out that Louis VI was not even the father of Louis VII, that Louis VI's mother had had an affair, and that, so Louis VI did not even know if he was the real king or not. Today we might have DNA tests that could determine if we were willing to dig up both Louis VI and Louis VII. But leaving that, Louis VII was very indecisive, and the French were getting the upper hand. I mean, pardon, the British were getting the upper hand. And along the edge of the French realm was a young maiden named Joanne who would pray, "Oh Lord, save France." Well, she claimed that she started hearing voices of the Archangel Michael and voices of St. Mark and St. Catherine, two saints who had lived hundreds of years before, female saints. But they were directing her, go to Paris. Go to the king, not Paris, go to the king and lead your people to victory against the English. Well, she went to the local nobleman, Sir Robert Beaumains, and of course, Sir Robert, when he first heard what she wanted to do, he laughed and kicked her out. Her father gave her a good whipping. For a while, her voices did not come back. But then her voices returned to her and told her to go, and she went back to Sir Robert. And one mystery, how did she ever persuade Sir Robert to send her to the king? Anyway, Sir Robert finally decided to send her to the king. He sent her to the king of France under an escort. They would travel at night and sleep and hide in the day. And to this day, there are people living in this part of France who will say, my ancestor hid Joanne of Arc. They're really proud of it. But she went to the king's court. The king got it. Wow, he was a smart man in a lot of ways. He got the idea, hey, I'm going to make a dunce of this peasant girl. So he called one of his lackeys and said, here, step into this adjacent room. So the king and the lackey stepped into the room and traded clothes. The king came out carrying a tray and dressed like a lackey. And the lackey sat on a throne with a scepter and a crown on his head. And they thought, we're making a dunce. Well, Joan of Arc came into the room, having supposed never seen the king. She ignored the man who was sitting on a throne with a crown on his head, and went straight up to the man in lackey clothes and bowed down. And the king was really surprised. How do you know me? You're the Dauphin. She wouldn't call him king because he had not been crowned. She said, you're the Dauphin. The court could do nothing but applaud. This act was done. I'm not going to try to explain what happened. I don't know. This act was done in the presence of the most educated men and women in Europe. All the court could do was applaud. Well, the king did not know what to do with this woman. He tried to pawn her off to a bishop to examine whether or not she were a virgin. And that was the rumor. We didn't know if she were a witch or a saint. The bishop finally decided that she was a virgin, and he pawned her off from one clergy to another. But ultimately, he wrote, hey, I am the nearest thing France has to a king. She might not call me king. She only calls me Dauphin. Dauphin was the crown prince. She only called me Dauphin, but I have to make the decision. So he did the unthinkable. He gave her the command of an army and sent her off to fight, and the city was being besieged. Now, I could go into more detail, but she won the battle. All told, she won 4 battles, but she was a very domineering woman to the point she even told the king and his generals what to do. And I guess the king got tired of her. She was finally captured by the Burgundians and who turned her over to the English. She was tried for witchcraft and burned at the stake. But her mother, in the meantime, was given, her father died 2 years of broken heart, but her family was given the title of nobility, which meant they were exempt from taxes, but also gave them the right to appeal directly to the Pope. So the mother appealed to the Pope. It took 2 popes. First one pope exonerated her of some of the charges, but left the charges of the clergymen who were still alive intact. But then that pope died, and the next pope, by the time the next pope took the throne, all the clergymen who had tried Joanne were dead. So the next pope completely exonerated Joan of Arc of all charges. In 1920, when Europe needed a hero, she was made a saint. Her day, as all saints have their day, her day is May 30th. What used to be Memorial Day in this country, the Day of the Dead. She was made a saint. All right, and I'm going to have to quit here. There's quite a bit more I wish I could have had time for, but we just don't. All right, now I want to say this about this. Okay, I'll cut this off. This test.